Okay, welcome to the final session on parliamentary sovereignty, the EU and the UK. In today's session, we're going to be looking at whether, not whether, but what the arguments are that Parliament is not, in fact, sovereign. Now, this video lesson is for the Friday of week A, so that's Friday the 24th, period 3. And I hope that over the weekend of the 25th and 26th, we'll be in a situation when we come back on the Monday of week B that Teams is working. And I know Teams is sort of working at the minute, but it's working in bits and bobs and fits and starts. And what I really want to do is have a Teams meeting so that we can all catch up about this Parliament sovereignty idea. So although I will invite you in Teams to the meeting, be aware that on Tuesday, Friday, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, Tuesday the 28th, I think, at any rate, the first lesson of week B next week, in period 4, we are hopefully going to be having a Teams meeting. So that will be live, that will be video and audio and all the rest of it. I remind you that you can't record that session. Okay, there'll be something sent out about that anyway, but just to remind you. Right, so is Parliament sovereign? Well, we looked last time at the yeses, and now we're going to look at the nos. The first argument that suggests Parliament does not have sovereignty is to do with the type of sovereignty that Parliament has. So pause for a few moments and try to recollect what two types of sovereignty there are and who has what type. Okay, hoping you've done that. Sovereignty is divided into legal sovereignty and political sovereignty, and legal sovereignty rests with Parliament, whereas political sovereignty rests with the people. Now, the argument runs that because Parliament has legal sovereignty, it is not, in fact, fully sovereign. It has legal sovereignty because the people have given it legal sovereignty. So political sovereignty is the important type, and that rests with the people, and the people devolve legal sovereignty to Parliament. And I've used the word devolve there deliberately because what you might be recognizing here is that this is actually an extension, or rather a variation on the argument about, say, for instance, the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament only exercises any degree of sovereignty because Westminster is prepared to allow that. Well, the same can be true here. Westminster only exercises any degree of sovereignty because the people are prepared to allow that. Parliament is therefore not fully sovereign, not truly sovereign, because actually it is the people who are sovereign. And although it's very unlikely to happen at this moment and in this country, a revolution, for instance, would actually remove parliamentary sovereignty. If Britain decided it was going to, become some sort of workers' republic or some sort of fascistic theocracy or whatever it is that decides the way forward is, Parliament would not be able to effectively fight back against that. It would use the organs of the state, like the police and potentially the army. But of course, if there's a military coup, or if the police or army are either ambivalent or actually anticipating in the uprising, then Parliament is powerless. So essentially, this argument is simply that the people are sovereign, and therefore Parliament only exercises any kind of power because people are prepared to allow it to happen. That connects quite nicely to the second of the arguments, which is this. Political realities make it clear that legal sovereignty is at best theoretical. Okay, so what I need you to do now is I need you to pause for however long this takes and think about what has happened politically in this country in the last 12 years, so since 2008. There's a lot, okay? But try not to think about it in terms of elections and governments. Try to think about it in terms of world events. So Small pause, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, trying to get together everything that's happened between 2008 and 2020 in terms of events. Okay, so I'm hoping that 2008 sticks in your minds as the start of a financial crisis. The financial crisis coincided almost with the election of the coalition government. And the coalition government was elected, they would argue, and there is some validity in the argument, on the basis of sorting out the appalling economic mess that had been made by the previous government. They did this in a variety of measures, but probably the word that is most associated with governments from 2010 onwards is austerity. There were pay freezes, there were funding cuts, various centres, political centres like Sure Start, political initiatives rather like Sure Start and so on were closed down. And the public basically got on with it. They clearly didn't mind too much. I mean, they I think even if they agreed with the form in which it was taking, the general argument of, you've got to cut your cloth accordingly, you've got to balance the books, and only when the books are balanced can we consider people's well-being. They largely tended to agree with that because they elected in 2015 a Conservative government, a purely Conservative government, whereas the Lib Dems, curiously, who were the party who out of the coalition partners were most against austerity, were pretty much wiped out, although they were really rubbish in terms of what they managed to achieve. So maybe it wasn't just austerity. But the point is that the financial crash led to austerity government. Now, in 2017 and 2019, there were no major commitments to public spending in the Conservative Party manifesto, and yet it won both times. So at best, the government could say that they'd been given a mandate to continue with austerity, and at worst, they could kind of say, well, austerity is not something which everyone likes, and we ourselves didn't like it, but we had to go along with it, and we'll see where we go. But basically, actually, we could summarize it in, I think it was a 1997 election poster for John Major's government, the Conservatives then. They campaigned with "Yes, it hurt, yes, it worked," and it was actually a very sort of similar situation, except that they weren't clearing up what they portrayed as the mess of the Labour government. They were clearing up what they portrayed as was a series of totally unavoidable but very unfortunate financial problems which came about, irrespective of what any government could do. But yes, it hurt, yes, it worked was kind of the argument. And then, of course, in December 2019, as well as the election of the Conservatives, you got the outbreak, first cases of coronavirus. And the government, newly elected, really pushed on the "we are throwing money at this problem." Now, if I were a cynical man, what I'd do is I'd play you the Chancellor's budget speech about however much money they want for the NHS, they will get. And then I'd cut back to a couple of years previously with loads of people laughing at extravagant promises from the Labour Party and saying, there's no magic money tree. But I'm not going to do that because that would be petty. So what I am going to do is simply point out that the government, in a national emergency, basically said, okay, fine, we'll find the money from somewhere. And if you look at what the government has done, and I'm not against any of this, I just want to make this really clear. They have promised money for healthcare, they've promised money for social care, they've promised money to local councils, they've promised money to small businesses, they've promised money to basically anybody whose job is vulnerable. What's the phrase of being furloughed, is it? Or it can't be furrowed. Furrowed is what my brow is doing now, trying to remember what the phrase is. But you know what I mean. Basically, the government has had an unparalleled peacetime spending commitment here. And this is the same party who were not in favour of austerity, but prepared to go through austerity. Why is that? The reason is because of, he says, excitingly using the pen which vanishes, political realities. Go away, the power. If the, but not authority, if the government had said, you know what, it's a shame this COVID thing, but the NHS should be better prepared, well, there's no way they would last as a government. If the NHS says they want more money, the government's got to give them more money. And it's not like a sort of peacetime, no one's really dying above normal rate. Oh, they could do with a bit of extra cash. This is like people are going to die. Boris Johnson himself has been treated in an NHS hospital. Okay, so the political reality is that people want to see investment in the NHS, and they don't really care where the money comes from. They just want the money to go in. People want to see small businesses surviving. They want to see people getting their paychecks. They want to see, care homes having the right amount of equipment. And that probably means paying over the odds because, you know what, that's the way the market works. But the point is, political reality now is different. And the government have tried to say, we're sticking with the policies which we have adopted since at least 2015 and arguably since 2010, they would not survive. I don't mean necessarily there'd be a revolution, but I mean the next election, they wouldn't last. So the political reality clearly indicates that legal sovereignty is a theoretical situation. The government is only able to exercise sovereignty to the extent that the public allow them to exercise sovereignty. People break the social distancing rule daily. But the government can't stop them. It's physically not possible to do so. There's not enough policemen, and there's a paradox there anyway. How would a policeman get close enough to you to stop you breaking the social distancing rule? But even leaving aside that, the political reality is you can't police everybody all the time. So legal sovereignty is a theoretical deal. Basically, the government's power exists because people are prepared to allow it to exercise power on their behalf. Okay? Quite a lengthy explanation, but relevant. Okay, thirdly, and third and fourth, these things take things in a rather different direction. The third point is that when we say political sovereignty rests with Parliament or sovereignty rests with Parliament, we are not telling the whole truth. What we really mean is that sovereignty doesn't rest with Parliament, it rests with the executive. There is no branch of Parliament more powerful than the executive, and the executive can overrule every single other process. It will obviously by default win votes in the House of Commons. It will win votes at the committee stage because the committees are made up proportionally. It will probably not always win votes in the House of Lords, but it can bypass the House of Lords, and the monarch signs anything that's put in front of her, frankly. So when we say Parliament is sovereign, that gives a misleading impression. That implies that the Lords, that the Commons, that the committees, that the bishops, that the civil service, and all the rest of it is sovereign equally. They're not. The executive is sovereign. And in fact, even more specifically, that group of about 20 to 25 individuals are sovereign. The cabinet, they are sovereign. So actually, it's not the Parliament that has the power, it is the executive. Oh, Mr. Weston, why didn't we do this before you gave us the elective dictatorship essay? Well, sometimes life just really, really gets annoying. Okay. Fourthly, now we're going to be leaping ahead a little bit here. Next year, you look at global views and globalization and world politics. Globalization suggests a world which is combined and integrated on many levels. Some of this integration is political, and some political integration can be fought against. I mean, the Brexit referendum is a step away from political globalization, but a lot of it's economic and a lot of it's social. And these things are much harder to unpick. A state can't really be self-supporting. Now, I think of all the nations in the world, I think only 8 states are capable of being self-sufficient. And very few states are able to rely on their population to fill all of the sort of vacancies that they have. What this is arguing is that actually national sovereignty no longer really exists. The UK Parliament can act in a particular way, and it is true that it can't be stopped by the House of Lords, let's say, or by any institution within the UK other than the people. It's also true that it can't be stopped by any institution outside the UK except the EU until January, when we leave. But actually, the reality is rather different. If the UK, were to announce, for instance, that it was opening up travel to everybody, you could move around freely, everyone was free to enter and leave the UK. In fact, we really encourage that. Then obviously, in this current time, coronavirus would spread massively, and it would be taken out to other countries and exported, and that would be bad news, and we don't find ourselves under economic sanctions and pressure. So even the national government doesn't have full sovereignty. If the UK declared war on, who should we say, Israel, okay, I've picked Israel for a reason, which is that Israel's biggest ally is probably America. The UK would be under serious pressure from America to stop any kind of military engagement in Israel. If the UK were to pick a side in the Syria conflict, then they'd be under pressure from the Russians on one side and the Americans on another to withdraw from that conflict. So in essence, this globalized world, this world of fundamental interconnectedness between nations, means that there isn't really such a thing as national sovereignty, or indeed sovereignty. If sovereignty means the sole right to decide what happens, then our government, our parliament, is not sovereign, because any decision that's taken about the future of the UK will be taken bearing in mind the views of the US or the EU or the Middle East or the OPEC countries, or, well, whatever we're talking about. I mean, it's a defense decision. It's to do with NATO. So globalization essentially overrules sovereignty. Now, that's a spurious argument to try to get into in the lower sixth, but it's one that's worth introducing now because we are talking about something that's going to be happening next year. Okay, so if we're looking at summarizing these, what conclusions could we draw? I want you to pause for a few moments and think about how you could sort of summarize this type of answer. Okay, so a couple of things that you might have got. Firstly, one of the answers, this one down here, the yellow one, is really a sort of pedantry kind of argument, isn't it? You know, it's not Parliament, it's the executive. Yes, but the executive comes from Parliament. These two answers up here are based on an understanding of sovereignty which runs somewhat deeper than most individuals would probably give it. The distinction between legal sovereignty and political sovereignty needs to be carefully understood. And this argument down here on the orange, that globalization means that national sovereignty is now an outdated concept, is a very abstract argument which is unprovable. Does this mean that none of these arguments work? No, not at all. All of these arguments work up to a point, but what it does mean is that you need to tread very carefully when defining sovereignty, or rather when defining where sovereignty lies. Because if you're sort of abstract and about it, and say, oh, well, you know, globalization means national sovereignty is an outdated concept. Well, you can say that, but you're going to need to justify it quite carefully, and you're going to need to explain why that is and how that is. So in other words, these arguments are essentially rather subtle, and they all depend on a very involved understanding of sovereignty. And if you contrast them with the arguments of saying, yes, Parliament is sovereign, then you'll find that those arguments tend to be quite a lot more straightforward. Now, I don't want to steer you in any particular direction, but if we're really looking at these arguments, what it boils down to is almost saying, well, that depends what you mean by sovereign, doesn't it? And if you look at the other arguments, the arguments on the yes side, you don't have that. You just have straightforward arguments. So if I were to conclude whether Parliament is sovereign or not, I would say, yes, Parliament is sovereign. because I have no wish to go down a sort of pedant's route about, well, it's only political sovereignty, isn't it, versus legal sovereignty and all the rest of it. Ultimately, it's up to you. But these arguments are so much more subtle and so much more nuanced that you've got to work very hard to make them work. And I think arguments that you have to make hard to make work are usually not that great. Okay. Hopefully we will be able to have a little bit of a discussion about this on the Tuesday. Keep checking your Teams stuff for invites, and we'll see how that goes. Thank you very much. Stay safe. Wash your hands. Bye.